For over 60 years, it was more than just a store. It was a Canadian institution. It was where you bought your first fridge, your child's winter snowsuit, and your craftsman tools that lasted a lifetime. It was the wish book that sat on every coffee table from Newfoundland to British Columbia, fueling the dreams of millions of children every Christmas. At its peak, Sears Canada was the largest retailer in the country. It was a juggernaut that seemed too big to fail, an empire of brick, mortar, and mail-order catalogs that defined the Canadian middle class. But on January 14, 2018, the music stopped. The last of its 140 stores shuttered their doors forever. 12,000 workers were left without jobs. Pensioners were left in a state of terror as their benefits were slashed. A billion-dollar empire had been reduced to empty aisles and for-lease signs. How did it happen? Was it simply the Amazon effect? Or was it a cold, calculated dismantling from the inside? Was Sears Canada a victim of progress or a victim of corporate greed? Today, we perform the autopsy on a retail legend. This is the rise and fall of Sears Canada. To understand why the fall of Sears Canada hurt so much, you have to understand what the brand represented. In a country as vast as Canada, Sears was the bridge between the urban center and the rural frontier. It wasn't just a department store. It was a promise. The slogan, "We service what we sell," wasn't just marketing. It was a social contract. If your washing machine broke in a small town in the prairies, a Sears technician would be there. They weren't just selling products, they were selling reliability. Sears Canada occupied a unique sweet spot in the market. It wasn't as high-end as Holt Renfrew, but it was more prestigious than Zellers or Walmart. It was the anchor of the Canadian mall. If a mall had a Sears, it was a real mall. Their house brands became household names. Kenmore appliances were in nearly every kitchen. Craftsman tools were passed down from father to son. Die-hard batteries were the only things Canadians trusted in a negative 40-degree winter. For decades, Sears Canada didn't just have customers, it had a nation's trust. The story of Sears Canada begins with a letter and a handshake in 1952. At the time, the Canadian retail landscape was dominated by local titans, the Hudson's Bay Company, Eaton's, and the Robert Simpson Company, known simply as Simpsons. In Chicago, the legendary chairman of Sears, Roebuck & Co., General Robert E. Wood, looked north. He saw a booming post-war Canada and a middle class that was moving to the suburbs. He wanted in, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He reached out to Edgar Burton, the president of Simpsons. On September 18, 1952, they signed a deal to create a 50-50 joint venture, Simpsons Sears Limited. This was a brilliant strategic alliance. Simpsons provided the Canadian expertise and an existing mail-order infrastructure. Sears provided the massive American supply chain, the world-class house brands, and a modern suburban retail model that would change Canada forever. The partnership was designed with a specific rule. Simpsons would keep its high-end stores in the big city centers, like downtown Toronto, while Simpsons Sears would conquer the suburbs and the small towns. It was a pincer movement on the Canadian wallet. By the 1970s, the Simpsons Sears model was unstoppable. They were building massive, full-line department stores as the anchors of the new suburban shopping malls. They were the pioneers of one-stop shopping. You could buy a suit, get your eyes tested, buy a set of tires, and have a slice of pie in the store restaurant, all in one visit. In 1973, they opened their first store under the solo Sears banner. The brand was becoming so dominant that the Simpsons name was starting to feel like a relic. In 1978, a massive shift occurred. The Hudson's Bay Company launched a hostile takeover of Simpsons. This forced the partnership to dissolve. Sears US bought out the Simpsons stake, and in 1984, the company was officially renamed Sears Canada, Inc. This was the peak era. In 1999, Sears Canada made what seemed like a checkmate move. Their biggest rival, the legendary Eaton's, had gone bankrupt.
Sears Canada swooped in and bought the remains, including the iconic flagship locations in Toronto and Vancouver. For a brief moment, Sears Canada was untouchable. They had the best real estate in the country, the most trusted brands, and a massive, profitable credit card business that was a literal cash machine. At the turn of the millennium, Sears Canada wasn't just a store, it was an empire.
In 2005, the fate of Sears Canada was tethered to a new captain. Eddie Lampert, a brilliant but controversial hedge fund manager, had merged Kmart and Sears in the U.S. to create Sears Holdings. As the majority shareholder of Sears Canada, Lampert's philosophy began to reshape the Canadian icon. Lampert didn't view Sears through the lens of a traditional retailer. He viewed it as a collection of assets. Under his influence, the company began a strategy that many critics called starving the stores. While competitors like Walmart and Canadian Tire were pouring billions into modernizing their shopping experience and e-commerce, Sears Canada's capital expenditure was slashed. The stores began to look dated. The carpets were frayed, the lighting was dim, and the shelves were often poorly stocked. But while the physical stores were crumbling, the balance sheet was being optimized. To keep the company afloat and provide returns to shareholders, Sears Canada began selling off its most valuable parts, the crown jewels. The credit card business. In 2005, Sears Canada sold its massive credit card and financial services division to J.P. Morgan Chase for $2.2 billion. It was a short-term cash injection that cost the company its most consistent profit engine. The real estate. They began selling the leases of their best locations. The iconic flagship at the Toronto Eaton Centre sold and turned into a Nordstrom. The Vancouver Pacific Centre location sold. The brands, names like Craftsman and Land's End, were eventually spun off or sold. By the mid-2010s, Sears Canada was a shell of its former self. It was a department store. In its final years, Sears Canada suffered from a severe identity crisis. It tried to be everything to everyone and ended up being nothing to anyone. One CEO tried to pivot to high-end fashion. The next tried to turn the store into a discount outlet. Meanwhile, the Amazon revolution was in full swing. Sears Canada, which had invented the mail-order catalog, the original online shopping, completely failed to build a modern digital platform. Their website was clunky and their logistics were a decade behind. The breaking point came in the summer of 2017. Sears Canada filed for protection under the Companies' Creditors Arrangement Act, or CCAA. They initially planned to close only 59 stores and reinvent the brand. But the Sears Initium Plan, a last-ditch effort by Executive Chairman Brandon Stranzel to save the company, fell through. No one was willing to bet on the ghost of a giant. On October 13, 2017, the Ontario Superior Court approved the total liquidation of the company. The liquidation was brutal. Longtime employees were told they would receive no severance. Even worse, the company's pension plan was facing a $267 million deficit. The very people who had built the company were the ones who paid the ultimate price. On January 14, 2018, the last Sears Canada store, located in the Pickering Town Centre, locked its doors for the final time. After 65 years, the wish book was finally closed. When the dust settled on the empty stores, a darker story emerged. It wasn't just about lost shopping malls. It was about the destruction of the Canadian retirement dream. Sears Canada left behind a pension deficit of nearly $267 million. Under Canadian law, secured creditors, the banks and the hedge funds, are the first in line to get paid during a bankruptcy. The employees and pensioners are at the bottom. This sparked a national debate that reached the halls of Parliament. How could a company pay out $1.5 billion in dividends and share buybacks to investors like Eddie Lampert over the previous decade, while its employee pension fund was starving?
for thousands of Canadians who had spent 30 or 40 years with the company.
Every Christmas, millions of Canadian children would sit on the floor and circle the things they wanted in the Sears wish book. It was a shared cultural experience that unified a country from sea to sea. Today, Sears Canada is a cautionary tale. It is the story of how quickly a legacy can be erased when the social contract between a company and its community is broken. It is a reminder that in the world of business, you either innovate with your customers or you are liquidated by your competitors. The red and white signs are gone. The service vans are off the road. But for a generation of Canadians, the memory of Sears Night at the mall remains a nostalgic fragment of a simpler time. Sears Canada didn't just go bankrupt, it was outlived by its own legend.